My name is Dacia Clay. I'm the audio librarian here at Classical 91.7. While I'm a real librarian, I have a deep, dark secret. I know very little about classical music. I grew up listening to rock, and I know something about jazz. But when it comes to classical, but I really want to learn. So, every week on this show, a classical music expert will give me a piece of classical music they think I should know, and then we'll discuss it. Come learn with me in the classical classroom. Hello everyone and welcome to the Classical Classroom. I'm Dacia Clay, and here with me today is composer, guitarist, and co-founder of Liminal Space Contemporary Music Ensemble, George Heathco. George, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, what will you be teaching me today?
I wanted to take just a brief look at the music and work of Dutch composer Louis Andriessen and point out a few things to maybe show how he's helped shape the current landscape of contemporary classical music, both here in the States and abroad.
Awesome. I like the sound of this. You had mentioned when we were talking before that he was kind of the progenitor of the alt-classical movement, but that maybe not a lot of people know that.
Yeah, in maybe some direct and indirect ways. He actually gained a lot of notoriety in the 1970s as being one of the more prominent and outspoken Dutch composers. He's been influential, not just as a composer, but also as an ensemble leader, a political activist, and a composition teacher. And so through all of those different facets, a number of performers and ensembles and composers here in the States have sort of taken his path as sort of a model for their own. Nice.
So what got you interested in his stuff? Did you just hear it and go, wow, that's awesome? Or were you studying? Or
There was a master class that was held at University of Houston my first year in grad school. And, listening to it, it's one of those things where it's like a mini light bulb moment.
Yeah.
I grew up playing rock music and, heavy metal and all sorts of pop styles outside of classical music.
Wait, what kind of metal did you play?
I would actually call it tech metal, which is sort of an offshoot of progressive metal and, really...
Are we talking like Yngwie Malmsteen? Are we talking like Cannibal Corpse? Are we talking Metallica?
If you look at bands like Meshuggah or Dillinger Escape Plan or...
Okay. I also played guitar when I was younger, and
cool.
I was very into the metal.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah. I spent much time playing Randy Rhoads.
Hopefully you'll enjoy Andriessen's music.
Okay,
when I first heard it, like I said, it was a light bulb moment because it seemed to capture a lot of that visceral experience that I had being in a band, but put it into a contemporary classical idiom.
Okay, I'm really excited about hearing some of this.
Yeah. Obviously, it's important to know it ran contrary to a lot of the prevailing mainstream classical music in the establishment in the Netherlands. And he actually picks and pulls from all sorts of styles, ranging from early medieval music to like post-bop and bebop music, jazz, and even some rock influence as well. And a lot of what he had written is really sort of a result of the types of ensembles that he put together. Mm-hmm. So his music actually was written for these very idiosyncratic type of groups made up of a lot of brass and winds, not a lot of stringed instruments. He also incorporated, and was one of the first composers to really kind of make, as a full-time instrument, electric guitars and electric basses. So a piece that might actually be a pretty representative work would be a work called Hoogtus, and it was actually written for his ensemble of the same name. The instrumentation is actually two amplified groups of pan flute, electric piano, bass guitar, percussion, and saxophones.
Is this going to get like Jethro Tull-y?
Perhaps. The name of the piece, Hoogtus, is actually taken from one of the big techniques that he's using called hocketing, which dates back to medieval music, and essentially it's like a melody or a set of chords that is actually broken up and placed across the ensemble. Almost, if you've been to church or seen bell choirs, different members of the bell choir each have their own note or two notes to play, and the melody or the piece as a whole is sort of this cooperative action in which everybody has to play their note at just the right time.
And it makes a chord.
Yeah, or it makes a melody, and it makes something that's you might normally think of only one person playing. And it creates a really cool stereophonic sound overall. And this piece is Hochtus. This is actually performed by the group Bang on a Can.
Okay.
But in this, you could actually hear this hocketing left and right chord. You hear one group playing on the right side of the headphones or your speaker, and then left side is the other group.
I see what you mean about the jazz influence.
Right. You can hear something that actually sounds a lot like maybe like a blues scale of some sort.
So I'm hearing in the speakers, it's going from, like, is that a production thing, or is this actually like, say there's an orchestra set up playing this or a group set up playing this?
It's two groups of instruments that are actually spaced to where they're facing each other on the stage.
So you, like, as an audience, you would get the same effect?
Ideally, yeah. It would probably be most effective if the audience were placed either really close or almost in between the two ensembles, so you can hear that interplay back and forth. But then that, the further you spread the instrumentalists apart, the more difficult and challenging the piece comes to stay together.
Yeah.
But that actually brings up a really good point. And his music, some of the sounds and some of the approaches that he employs are often making his performers do these very virtuosic feats. So players are just essentially made to perform, at full volume for long stretches of time. It's great because a lot of his approach was to have this very democratized type of music making in which everybody had to essentially give their 100% in order for the effect to actually work. So it actually made some sort of political statement towards music making. Everybody had to be involved and everybody had to put forth effort.
Yeah, like, so nobody's the star. It's the entire group.
It was important to a lot of his music because he wanted not only the performers to have this democratized type of sound, but for the audience member as well. It was a way to get into, as I mentioned earlier, that visceral experience in the music. Some of the things that made his ensembles, I think, really appealing to American audiences is he oftentimes chose very unconventional venues, things like protests and rallies, warehouses, and museum galleries, as opposed to concert halls and as opposed to like recital halls. And so having this loud, intense, in-your-face music was sort of a way to help rally the troops.
He sounds kind of like the I don't know, sort of like the classical music version of I don't know why this is springing to mind, but I'm thinking about like Velvet Underground.
Okay, yeah.
How they were just a very unique band and the type of music they chose to play, but also like some of the places they chose to play and the people with whom they played, and it created a certain atmosphere that you might not have at other performances, but mostly in that they influence so many people now. So you were saying how Andriessen influenced so much of what's going on in like alt classical music today.
Right.
So I keep throwing around this word alt classical, but I realize that maybe not everyone has heard all of our shows. If you haven't, go listen to them now. But we've done a show where we kind of touched on alt classical, which is also called indie classical, and lots of other things. George, maybe you could better explain the movement or the whatever you call it better than I could.
It's pretty difficult to define. I think I will use the term hipster for a moment. If you're a hipster, you don't want to identify yourself as a hipster. So I think a lot of the ensembles and composers in the alt classical world often maybe turn away from that term a little bit. But a lot of the music is maybe derived from sources outside of the typical classical canon. So a lot of rock music, a lot of music from other cultures make its way into this alt classical world. The instrumentation oftentimes includes things like electric guitars and drum sets, and maybe even the vocal style leaves sort of the classical bel canto tradition into more of a pop, a straight tone type of technique.
I think the entire idea of this kind of branching out is that you don't like being confined to something, and yet we all have this need to sort of define things. Right. So, you got to call it something, but
there's contradictions there. Oddly enough, contradiction was something that Andriessen was particularly fond of. One of his more popular pieces and well-known pieces is called Die Stadt. It's The Republic. It's actually based off of Plato's The Republic. And in this, Plato actually ends up writing about the use of certain modes or certain musical motifs, even musical instruments that have this ability to essentially change the course politically of a culture, of an environment. And some of what he writes seems just downright negative towards that, almost calling for musicians and composers to cease the experimentation so as to not ruffle feathers. And Andriessen constructs this very large 35-minute piece around some of those ideas. And on one hand, he's kind of scoffing at the idea that music is able to produce that type of change, and so all of these things that in the Republic, these modes and rhythmic shifts and all of these things that are talked about in a negative form, Andriessen just goes ahead and plows right through those, writes specifically in some of those modes or uses some of those rhythmic devices. So on one hand, he's scoffing at that assertion, but then on the other hand, he's actually he really loves that idea that music could perhaps produce or be this catalyst for change.
So did Andriessen, so you said he was around in the 70s-ish?
Yeah, I think a lot of his popularity began, really with the 70s. He was born in 1939 to a family that is essentially the Von Trapp family of musicians and musicianly people. His mother was a professional pianist. His father was actually a well-known composer in Holland, Hendrik Andriessen. His brother, Urian, was also a noted composer, as well as his sister, Cecilia.
Wow. And,
in fact, his father and his brother were his first composition teachers.
Wow.
Beginning when he was around 11. And so the 1950s and 60s were sort of a period of experimentation for him in terms of compositional styles. He essentially experimented with number of different types of approaches, especially modernist approaches, serialism, these textural types of pieces, improvisational music, something in which maybe elements of the music were kind of left more up to the performer. Andriessen actually was and is still just a huge fan of just improvisation. Maybe not in the typical approach that we might think of, with jazz improvisation, but things like gestures, actual movements on the piano. So improvisation was a very large chunk of this early experimentation, and as well as collage, which sounds musically like what you might visually see on a picture somewhere. Taking various styles and genres, even particular pieces, and actually juxtaposing or setting on top of each other, in kind kind of an extended fashion. You may be familiar with Luciano Berio's Sinfonia.
Yes.
One of the movements of Berio's Sinfonia is a large movement of collage.
We featured that on a program that we did on the history of the remix.
Right.
And we featured that part because it was, a remix of.
Interesting to note that Andriessen was actually studying with Luciano Berio around the time of that piece.
I was totally going to say that the last piece sounded kind of like Berio.
Yeah, and that's it's probably no coincidence. With Andriessen's music, you may have noticed some amount of repetition, very similar to what we might think of as minimalism. Andriessen actually became really interested in minimalist techniques, starting around the 70s, and actually incorporated that repetitive cellular type of style into his music. This piece, De Materie, is a really good example of something that I identify with Andriessen's music. It's loud, it's brassy, it's got this big clashy chord, and the whole opening to this movement is 144 repetitions of the same chord.
144 repetitions?
144, yes.
Is that purposeful, the 144, 12 times 12? Like, is that?
I don't know that it's 12 times 12, but the piece is, as with a lot of his music, is very mathematically approached in terms of proportions. So something that sets out proportionally for the rest of the piece is found with this 144.
The timing's kind of weird, or am I just hearing things?
No, you're hearing that correctly. The chords start off spaced pretty far apart, and as it progresses through these repetitions, they start to get closer and closer together. The repetitions become faster and, much more energized. When there's like the first very large harmony change, chord change, it feels like a big, impactful moment following all of this build up on that same chord.
I wasn't expecting that.
Big, brassy, in-your-face type of sound.
That is going to be so hard to perform as a group, like to get that syncopation. I mean, to be synced up like that.
Exactly. To time it right, to keep the energy going, right? The same dynamic level. It's very difficult.
So, I'm really interested in finding out who is drawing on Andriessen's work.
Other composers and ensembles, Bang in a Can.
Yeah.
That's one of the most obvious groups that's taken influence. There's a really neat thing that happens with ensembles, actually, following Andriessen. He wrote pieces for specific groups and oftentimes required these very idiosyncratic, ensembles that were only aligned to that one piece that he had composed. So that makes it really difficult to have your works performed. And so a number of ensembles actually formed, based off of instrumentation for his pieces, so they could actually perform those works, but then they actually expanded beyond that to, commission works from other composers. And one such group is a group called Icebreaker, that formed to play Hochtus, the piece we heard earlier.
So the entire group began just to play this one piece.
Correct. In college, they all got together and they wanted to play that piece. They enjoyed working together, so they formed Icebreaker.
That's super cool.
Again, that's two groups of amplified pan flutes, electric piano, bass guitar, percussion, and saxophone. And Icebreaker also includes accordion and violin as well. One of the pieces that I brought in is a piece by Michael Gordon. He's a co-founder of Bang on a Can, and he had written this piece for Icebreaker called Yo Shakespeare. And it's really good. I think it's a really good example of his style, and you can hear a lot of Andriessen's influence just in the rhythmic propulsion, these polyrhythmic things that are happening between different groups in the ensemble, repetition on like a single idea or a single phrase. And I think just the overall visceral experience of just listening to some of this like in-your-face aggressive music, very typical of Andriessen's music and Michael Gordon's music. There's a lot of rhythmic energy in which like these different groups are playing rhythms and sets of rhythms that don't line up with the other groups in sort of a way that we're used to hearing or used to feeling. Creates a kind of a very, I don't know, the feel to me is it feels like almost like cloud-like. You have no real footing as to where time is, where one is. You feel like you're just floating through these rhythms. Yeah. Even though there are like these propulsions, like very strong hits, strong rhythmic units that are clearly marking where a beat would be. You don't feel, to me personally, I don't feel that there's a steady ground.
Yeah, it's very geometric. It's like you're inside of a weird shape that's being made. Oh, now I'm hearing the flute. I was like, you kept talking about pan flute, and I was like, there is no flute in this. That's so neat. I like the sound of that.
I like the idea of the geometric patterns, too, the shapes. I think that's right in line with a lot of the techniques for how a lot of this music is created. A lot of times mathematics actually plays into composing these types of works. I can't speak for Yoke Shakespeare completely, but oftentimes, especially with minimalism and this like more alt classical or even like post-minimalism type of sound. As I mentioned with the Andriessen piece, it's where proportions are set up mathematically throughout a piece in order for something to line up. Maybe outside what we might think of as a typical phrase, right? But produces, again, these types of shapes that you're talking about. Things that are flowing in and out of each other.
I think this kind of music sounds really exciting. It always seems to have like a sort of urgency to it. I don't know what that is, but like in minimalist pieces that I've heard and in this music that you've introduced me to today, like there's this sort of nameless urgency to like this music just sort of spontaneously burst out of nowhere and has to be made.
I use the phrase audacious music a lot when I'm thinking of this because you're right, it's very direct. And it seems that the composers and these ensembles, when they're presenting the work, you're right, they have something to say, but it's, sometimes the thing that they're saying is not the most popular thing to say. But these composers are, in your face saying it directly to you.
This is no tender Sarah McLachlan music.
Yeah, and it's, it's completely unabashed, repetition on some of this stuff. This approach, especially with Andriessen's music, is it's very purposeful. As I was saying, it was often played at rallies, at demonstrations. It was a means to gather the masses, in some sort of way that only classical music that's loud and in your face can. Actually urge folks on.
So was he sort of politically
charged?
Yeah, like personally was he?
Yeah, on one hand, the politics that he's engaged in is like the politics of classical music and how the major orchestra in town in the Netherlands, the Concertgebouw, is sort of the large ensemble that everybody kind of looks to, and the music was maybe more conservatively programmed than Andriessen would have liked, oftentimes neglected modern music. And so there was some political activism, directed towards that.
I see.
And then, of course, around the time of the Vietnam War, Andriessen got involved in demonstrations that were protesting specifically America's involvement in the Vietnam War.
I see. Okay, so that's the political, like the rallies that you're talking about.
Yes. There's those rallies, and it's actually sort of a funny anecdote with his activism and the classical music politics. He and a group of other composers were in this group called the Nutcrackers, and they sort of made it their mission to go in and disrupt classical music performances. November 17th, 1969, at the Concertgebouw, there's I believe it was a flute concerto that was being performed. And so Andriessen and his fellow nutcrackers showed up to the concert with slide whistles, penny whistles, and various, clackers and shakers and things, noisemakers, and essentially disrupted the performance and were, forcibly removed. And they did that a number of times, and on one occasion they were arrested and they served a 1-week-long jail sentence for disrupting. And his music, I think, is something that was really influential to a lot of people because of its direct approach, the direct sound that he got out of it. But he was also a well-known teacher of composition. So a number of his students are actually currently working in this alt classical world.
Really?
Yeah, itself. So composers like Missy Mazzoli, another composer, Kate Moore. She's an Australian composer. Oscar Bettison. One thing that really pops up in a lot of his music that I've heard is just this focus on long-term singular ideas, right? He spends a lot of time on maybe one specific idea. It might be sort of the basis behind an entire movement or an entire piece, right? But it's very focused. There's repetition, but a lot of times it's very loose repetition, like it's not repeating the same phrase or the same rhythm over and over again, but it might be, say, the same pitch material gets repeated.
This is him playing right now?
Yes, this is a piece called Oh Death.
Oh Death.
Oh Death.
You. It's electric bass.
Well, it's actually an electric guitar that's got an octave pedal that's dropped it an octave lower.
And that is a construction site.
Somebody's, working inside of a piano,
Tiny
kneading the
elves,
strings, and of
angry,
course you could hear the saxophones wailing.
Yeah.
Aggressive, forceful rhythms. That's sort of how I describe some of this. With the ensemble and the approach, this particular piece, Oh Death, it actually explores a lot of different, different styles. Like Andriessen's music, it's the contradiction of a lot of times having this huge amount of energy and drive, juxtaposed to something that is very static, very slow going. And so that's, you hear that all throughout Bettison's Oh Death. And it's an hour-long piece.
Really?
Yeah.
An hour-long exploration of...
It's written, despite not having, vocals or any vocal ensembles in there, it's actually written loosely around the idea of being a requiem. So it explores Mozart's Requiem in a very abstract way.
Yeah. So what I think is kind of interesting about a lot of, contemporary classical music is the sort of themes that it seems to be exploring. Like, a lot of it's very dark, kind of focused on this very urban, intellectual,
right?
Sort of mindscape. Everything's very neurotic. and I think it speaks a lot to what's going on in our culture now. It's definitely the soundtrack to what you feel like when you're stuck in a traffic jam, or when you're not a special snowflake in a crazy downtown crowd, walking along, and everybody's on their cell phones, and
But yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of that, just these darker themes. I think you hit it on the head with the idea of these urban soundscapes, right? One of the last things I want to play, I keep mentioning Bang in a Can because, as I was saying, I think that's probably the more obvious ensemble. But one of the other co-founders, David Lang, is one of the composers. Is actually modeled a lot of his style off of just this really highly repetitive, singular idea approach that Andriessen has kind of put out there. And Lang's music is definitely minimalist. It's very repetitive, right? But again, has that angular kind of clashy dissonance to it that we're finding in Andriessen's music. This particular piece is called Pierced. I like this one specifically because you hear a string orchestra that's underneath and supporting this ensemble of vibraphone, piano, and cello. Mm-hmm. And those three instruments are playing this just really charged rhythmic unit that sounds a lot like something that would have been found in, say, Frank Zappa's music. And it's funny, even in the score for that part, Zappa-esque is written as one of the
really
one of the markings.
I like that sound of the vibraphone and the piano playing together. That's kind of neat.
It's very, it's very metallic sound.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned the idea of mathematics. This piece is really interesting in the way the rhythms work, because that really cool, angular, and very syncopated line that you're hearing with the piano and vibraphones, there's a specific rhythm that they're playing that goes to a specific set of numbers, like a grouping of 3 followed by 4 followed by 5, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4. And it's a specific rhythm that lasts for I can't remember the number of beats, but it's set in stone, and they repeat this rhythm obsessively throughout the piece. But that same rhythm governs what you also hear, and if you listen closely, there's a bass drum, a kick drum that hits, and every time that kick drum hits, it's taking that same rhythmic idea that's presented with the those three instruments, right? But it's actually elongated it now, and it's made it into a much longer version, but it's the same ratio, same proportions.
My God.
And the strings that are playing, the strings, again, same thing. It's the same rhythm, but augmented and made much larger, but it's the same proportions and the same design.
That is too much math. Too much math is happening in this music.
But you don't necessarily hear it as math, and I think that's important to note in listening to this. Like, that math and all of that stuff doesn't necessarily have to influence the listener so much. I mean, it's used as process to create the music, but not necessary for a listener to really be in the know.
I think that's puzzling about, maybe, I don't know, puzzling. It's I think about this a lot with contemporary classical, where it seems almost as if a lot of it is not necessarily made for listening, but for performing.
Right.
It's almost like it's about process, it's about performance. It's perhaps not for listening to at home. Unless you, I don't know, I personally can't see listening to it at home. It's not something that I would, want to sing along to, or, I guess it also depends on what it is that you see music being used for.
Sure. Well, I think that's a tricky subject, because I think each composer is obviously going to have his or her own opinion of what he or she expects of the audience and of the performers. Some of this music is, I mentioned Missy Mazzoli, one of Andriessen's students. Her music is very much approached from just the experience of, herself actually listening to and being involved in a lot of, pop music. And so it actually, it's rather direct and actually hits and sounds, very similar and closely aligned to pop music, although it still has a lot of the same type of process, underlying a lot of the music. But then there's stuff that's almost entirely process driven that, is sometimes really challenging to listen to, that the composers, wanted to put the listener in some sort of, uncomfortable experience. But it's, I think it's different for everybody. And it's a matter of uncovering stones and uncovering, all of these things hidden, but it's all out there.
But in taste too, it's a matter of
Sure.
taste. Like this might sound like happy music to someone who is not me. So Andriessen, like when we were talking before, you had said that he's influenced a lot of people, but he's kind of not that well known. Like he seems like he was kind of a behind the scenes guy, and maybe still is. You said he was still living.
Yeah, he's still living in Europe and in like the New York scenes. I think he's definitely got much more of a prominent name, and there's much more of a wider audience for his music. But yeah, definitely, I think because of the types of ensembles that he writes for, it doesn't get performed nearly as often as as maybe he would like, and so yeah, the name isn't as familiar. Although in Washington D.C. in April, there is a giant week-long celebration for Andriessen's 75th birthday.
Andriessen Fest.
Yes, Andriessen 75. So there's actually going to be a week-long festival of, performances and activities based around his music.
Cool.
So
everybody go out and see that.
Yes, so I'll fly out to Washington, D.C. together.
George, thanks so much for coming on to the show today. I really love being introduced to, especially contemporary classical stuff. I don't know, it seems to, like, I connect a little more with it personally than some of the sort of traditional classical music. Well, I think that's very lovely. It doesn't, like, connect with me personally. So this has been really cool.
That's cool to hear.
Yeah. Well, you have to come back and teach me more about this kinds of music.
I hope to be invited back. Thank you very much for having me. This has been fun.
Yeah. So, you guys may have heard, if you've been listening to the show for a while, that I have made a New Year's resolution to go out and see more classical music shows. And if you go to our webpage, which is classical917.org/classroom, there are instructions on there for how to make your case as to why I should come and see your show, because of course I'm very busy and I can't go to them all, but I'd love to come to some. So convince me and I'll come see your stuff, and we'll share your pitch with our listening audience. Also, P.S., a lot of you listen to us through iTunes. If you have not yet reviewed or rated our show, do it. What are you waiting for? If you want to hear past episodes or see what's coming up on the show, you can also go to that webpage that I just said, classical917.org/classroom. If you want to hear anything addressed on the show, send me an email at dclay@classical917.org. I think that's it. Yep. All right. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.